fired and evicted on the same day. But the man who helped her changed everything. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The morning began with the warm breeze of spring slipping through the glass door of the flower shop, carrying the sweet scent of newly arrived peonies. Eliza Callahan arranged the vases with practiced automatic movements, unaware it would be her last day there. Her delicate fingers secured the stems with quiet confidence, her gaze focused, instinctively blending colors with the ease of someone who understood flowers like she did people. She had worked there for nearly 2 years, and despite the shop's recent financial struggles, she remained loyal, maybe out of stubbornness, maybe out of necessity. At 9:20 a.m., she was called to the back room, where the manager waited with a strained expression. There was no softening of the blow. The store could no longer afford 2 employees, and Eliza, with no children or permanent contract, would be let go. She was handed an envelope containing her overdue vacation pay and walked out of the shop, still clutching her apron. She wandered toward the town square and used the last coins in her pocket to buy 2 small loaves of bread. She knew she couldn't fall apart. Not then. Mia was waiting at home, and that 13-year-old girl was the only reason Eliza kept pushing forward. Their building was old, with narrow staircases and walls stained by moisture. It sat in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Burlington, far from the center, but close enough to access the bus line. The apartment was tiny, just enough for 2 sisters who had learned to live with little and still keep their dignity. Eliza entered quietly and found Mia lying on the mattress, a geography book open on her lap, her hair tied back in a loose bun. Eliza smiled to avoid alarming her. She sliced the bread, added a bit of butter, boiled some water for tea, and sat on the edge of the bed trying to appear casual. Mia asked how her day had gone. Eliza replied simply, long. The hours crept by, heavy and unresolved. Just after 5 o'clock, a sharp knock rattled the door. It was the building superintendent, holding a formal notice. The building had been sold, and all overdue rents needed to be paid or vacated by the end of the day. Eliza tried to explain, begged for time, told him she'd lost her job just hours earlier. But he merely looked down, handed her the paper, and left. The world collapsed into a few square feet. In minutes, plastic bags turned into makeshift suitcases. Backpacks were stuffed with folded clothes, and the 2 warmest blankets were set aside. Mia said nothing, simply followed Eliza's instructions, stacking belongings into grocery bags. The afternoon disappeared quickly. Eliza called shelters, left voicemails at emergency numbers, looked up local church housing programs. Everything was full. One friend was out of town. Another didn't have room. Their upstairs neighbor wouldn't even open the door. Fear began to take a tangible shape. Mia could feel it, even if she didn't speak it aloud. By 8 o'clock, Eliza locked the apartment door for the last time, her eyes dry, her jaw clenched. They descended the 2 flights without looking back, each carrying a bag and a few sagging plastic sacks. The streets felt colder. They had nowhere to go, just the need to find someplace safe for one night. They walked toward the bus station, trying not to draw attention. Eliza avoided eye contact, kept Mia close, mentally listing the places she hadn't tried yet. They passed a shuttered pharmacy, a bar where music thumped through the windows, and a group of men sitting on a curb. They were about to cross the avenue when a black car with tinted windows slowly pulled up to the curb. A sharply dressed man stepped out of the passenger seat, his demeanor polite but steady, and walked toward them holding a sheet of paper. He addressed Eliza by her full name. Saw he worked for Mr. Graham Smith, the new owner of the building, and had been sent to find them. He referenced the eviction, mentioned Mia, and told her they knew she had nowhere to go. The offer was simple: temporary housing at a private residence just outside of town until she could get back on her feet. No strings attached, just helped out. Eliza hesitated. Mia looked up at her, waiting in silence. Her mind raced. It was a risk. But what other option did they have? The man read matters. He said his name didn't pressure them. He just waited. Eliza nodded faintly and opened the car door. The drive lasted about 40 minutes, winding through open fields, moonlit stretches of countryside, and quiet rural roads. The house appeared around a bend, tucked behind tall trees with clean lines of wood and glass. Some windows were lit, but there was no movement inside. When they arrived, Reed stepped out, opened the car door, and led them to the entrance. Eliza, heart pounding, helped Mia out and walked up the front steps. That's when the main door opened. A tall man with a composed expression and an unmistakable presence stood beneath the soft light of the entryway. She didn't know him personally, but the name was clear. Graham Smith, the name on the eviction notice. The man whose signature had ended their tenancy. And now he was standing in front of them, silent, observing. "I'm Graham Smith. We can talk." "Tomorrow," he said calmly. "Tonight you need to rest." Without waiting for an answer, he reached for the bags Mia was holding. Eliza paused, but eventually let go of her backpack strap. Graham lifted the weight easily and turned, leading them up the steps. The inside of the house was spacious, clean, and orderly. The scent of polished wood mingled with that of freshly laundered fabric. There were few decorations, everything in neutral tones. No clutter, no overt warmth, just a functional space, clearly designed not to offend. The room assigned to them was upstairs, with large windows overlooking a garden out back. The bed was wide, the sheets tightly tucked, and a folded robe rested on a chair. Graham placed the bags gently on the floor, glanced briefly at Mia, then at Eliza. "If you need anything, let me know. The bathroom's right here." He exited quietly and shut the door behind him. Eliza stood still for a moment, scanning the room like someone checking for traps in unfamiliar territory. Mia moved slowly toward the bed and sat on the edge, gripping the hem of her sweatshirt. Neither of them spoke, but both knew the night ahead would be long. They were no longer on the street. They were under the roof of the man responsible for their eviction who, for reasons they didn't yet understand, was now offering them shelter. Waking up in an unfamiliar place is never easy, even when the mattress is soft and the room appears clean. Eliza opened her eyes with the strange sensation that she was still caught in a dream she hadn't finished having. Soft morning light filtered through the beige curtains, and the silence of the house was a stark contrast to the familiar background noise of neighbors she used to hear every morning in the old apartment. She sat at the edge of the bed and took a few seconds to remember where she was. Mia, already awake, was on her phone pretending nothing was different, but the uneasiness showed in her posture. The room was spacious and neutral, with no signs of a person who might have lived there before. In the bathroom, everything looked untouched, towels folded precisely, soap still wrapped, and a mirror so spotless it seemed to reject the idea of any disorder. Down in the kitchen, breakfast had been quietly prepared. On the counter, a paper bag held fresh bread rolls still warm, alongside butter, strawberry jam, 2 cups of plain yogurt, a sliced apple, and a thermos of hot coffee. No instructions. Just the quiet realization that someone had taken care of it before they'd woken up. After breakfast, Eliza sought out Graham. She needed answers. She found him in an office off the main hallway, seated in front of a glowing computer screen and a stack of documents. When he saw her, he closed the laptop with quiet intention and motioned to the chair opposite his desk. Once she sat down, he got right to the point. "Good morning. You're probably still trying to understand what's happening, so I'll be straightforward. The eviction notice you received was processed before the ownership transfer was fully complete. The previous management left a number of issues unresolved. By the time I took over, the notices had already been sent, including yours. There wasn't enough time to review every situation individually. He looked at her with the kind of seriousness that came from someone unaccustomed to explaining himself. Yesterday, the superintendent told me that you and your sister were on the street with nowhere to go. That's not how I do things. And it shouldn't have happened that way. I asked Reed to find you. It was the least I could do. Eliza didn't respond immediately. She was still processing. Graham continued, his tone measured but resolute. You can stay here as long as you need. No one's going to ask anything of you. Take your time finding a job. Someone comes twice a week to help with housework, but otherwise, you'll have your privacy. If you need anything, just ask me directly. He wasn't offering charity, nor was he trying to be magnanimous. It was a correction, something he clearly saw as his responsibility. Eliza gave a brief nod. Thank you for being clear. She still didn't know if she could trust him, but at least she wouldn't be treated like a burden. Before leaving, she asked if there was a school nearby. Graham explained that a small public school in a nearby town was about 15 minutes away, and that he personally knew the principal. I can reach out and let her know you're looking for a spot for Mia, he said, already unlocking his phone. Eliza nodded. That would help a lot. She needs to keep up with her year. The other school is too far now. When she returned to the bedroom, Mia was sitting at the window, quietly looking out at the backyard. She didn't say anything, but a glance was enough. She, too, was wondering how long they'd be allowed to stay and what would come next. In the days that followed, Eliza focused on small tasks. Not because she had to, but because she needed to keep her mind busy. She washed the dishes they used, folded the laundry from the outdoor line, and kept their room tidy. She didn't cross paths with Graham often, but she knew he noticed. Their conversations were rare, brief, and strictly practical. Mia, on the other hand, acted with more independence. She explored the surroundings, used the internet connection to access her old school's online platform, and managed to keep up with classes while they waited to secure her new enrollment. One afternoon, she found a neglected greenhouse at the edge of the yard and told Eliza it could make a great garden. She was curious but respectful. She didn't cross boundaries, just observed. Graham found her there once. They exchanged a few words, nothing forced. Just two people acknowledging the same space. It was enough to confirm what Eliza already sensed. The house was beautiful, but it showed no signs of real life. The house was large, silent, and efficient, but it lacked warmth. It felt like a place people passed through, not a home anyone truly lived in. Eliza noticed in the details. Cabinets too neatly arranged, chairs always perfectly aligned. No photos or personal touches. Graham seemed to reside there out of routine, not choice, and that intrigued her more than she was comfortable admitting. Still, she kept her distance. She updated her resume, searched for jobs in local shops and grocery stores, and even considered emailing her former flower shop manager to ask for a recommendation. She didn't know when she would leave, but she knew she eventually would. That thought was non-negotiable. She couldn't afford to settle in. One night, Mia asked directly, "Does he seem weird to you?" Eliza answered honestly, "He does. But he's been respectful, and that's already more than most." Mia nodded. They both knew the house wasn't a home. Not yet. But for now, it was a roof over their heads, and that was something. The rhythm of life that formed wasn't exactly predictable, but it followed its own kind of logic. During the day, Eliza alternated between scanning job listings on the computer and drifting through small tasks around the house. After sending Out applications to local bakeries, grocery stores, and garden centers, she always found herself needing to use her hands. That's when she began paying more attention to the yard. The outdoor space was wide, overgrown, and clearly overlooked. The rosebush were wild, the lavender unruly, and weeds blurred the edges of every flower bed. But the soil was good. All it needed was care. On a quiet Wednesday morning, she grabbed an old bucket and a worn pair of gloves she'd found in the laundry room and stepped outside to start clearing dead leaves and dry branches. She didn't ask permission. She just did it. It felt instinctive, nearly personal. People who love flowers can't stand to see them neglected. In that garden, Eliza found a place that didn't ask for explanations, just patience, focus, and motion. Mia watched her sister from a distance, with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Most mornings, she studied on the tablet that Graham had left on the dining table, a new device delivered without a word. Afternoons were often spent in the reading room, where she discovered a low bookshelf filled with old editions of children's novels. That's where Graham found her the first time, sitting cross-legged on the floor, deeply immersed in The Little Prince. He didn't interrupt. He simply asked if she liked that kind of story. Mia nodded and began telling him about other books she'd read in school, characters she loved, authors she still wanted to explore. The conversation didn't last 10 minutes, but the next morning she found a small book of short stories and an illustrated copy of Sophie's Misfortunes waiting on the table. No explanation. Just the books as if they had appeared by coincidence. But she knew they hadn't. Eliza noticed the gesture but said nothing. She recognized in Mia a lightness she herself could no longer maintain. Her sister was polite, observant, still untouched by the weight Eliza carried. She spoke to Graham with the openness of someone who trusted adults by default. There was no closeness, but there was ease. And that was enough. Sometimes, while pulling weeds or watering salvaged pots in the old greenhouse, Eliza caught glimpses of their brief conversations. They stirred something inside her she couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't mistrust. It was simply the quiet ache of watching the world keep turning when you still don't know where to step. Even so, she didn't interfere. She encouraged Mia to enjoy what was offered, and she returned to the garden, where each sprouting plant felt like a silent attempt to reshape her own direction. Graham never interrupted her, but he watched. From the office, from the upstairs window, he'd see her bent over the flower beds. Hair tied back, shirt smudged with dirt, hands steady around a spade. She didn't use proper tools or new gloves, but her movements were exact. She didn't hesitate. One morning, he approached quietly and asked if she had worked in gardening before. Eliza answered without hesitation. I used to be a florist. After my mom passed, it was the only thing I could do that made sense. I never studied landscaping, but I've always had a hand for plants. Graham just nodded. He didn't offer help, only mentioned that the soil was old but rich, and that the previous owners had once grown hydrangeas in that very spot. Then he walked away. There was no judgment in his tone, just a fact. And for reasons she didn't fully understand, that kept her going. By the end of the week, the garden had already begun to change. Beds were cleared, borders shaped, a few new flowers transplanted from forgotten pots. Mia started helping in the warmer mornings, suggesting they try herbs like chamomile or sunflowers. One day, Graham left a small wheelbarrow by the greenhouse, filled with fresh soil bags and a new set of tools. He said nothing, just left them there. Eliza saw it. She didn't comment. It was as if they'd struck a silent agreement. She would rebuild the garden, and he would support it from the background. No words were needed, but something unspoken was forming between them. A language that relied on gestures instead of conversations. And Mia, right between them, seemed to instinctively know how to move within that space dot at night. After Mia was asleep, Eliza would sometimes sit alone on the side porch. Not because it was a habit, but because the cool air helped her think. She watched the darkness fall across the fields, listened to distant crickets, and the occasional snap of a branch in the wind. Graham rarely appeared during those hours, but once he walked by and gave her a small nod. She returned it silently. It was strange, being there. The house wasn't hers. The bed wasn't hers. And the man who had signed the eviction notice still felt, in some ways, like a stranger. But slowly, something inside her was shifting. Not stability, not certainty. Just a patch of ground that didn't feel quite so unsteady. And maybe, for now, that was enough. On Sunday morning, the weather turned. The sky woke up heavy with clouds, and a steady wind swept across the field surrounding the house, rustling the dry leaves gathered in the corners of the yard. Eliza postponed going outside and spent much of the day in the kitchen, baking a simple yogurt cake with the leftover fruit from the week. Mia was curled up on the couch, absorbed in an adventure novel, her feet tucked under a thin blanket. The house felt livelier than it had on previous days, though no one said anything aloud. Graham appeared in the late afternoon, wearing a navy shirt and the air of someone returning from an unspoken errand. He paused at the edge of the room, catching the sweet scent from the oven, and asked if it was apricot. Eliza nodded without taking off her oven mitts. He didn't press for conversation, but lingered quietly against the doorway, watching her slice the cake with careful precision. Later, after Mia had gone to her room, Eliza gathered the mugs and stepped out onto the porch, where she'd left a small basket filled with mint seedlings. She was arranging the pots when she heard footsteps behind her. Graham stood near the glass door, hands in his pockets, eyes on the overcast sky. He stayed like that for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to speak. Then, with quiet ease, he said, "This house was supposed to be ours. Mine and Pauline's." Eliza didn't answer right away. She kept adjusting the pots, though her hands had slowed. Graham sat in one of the chairs and kept his eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the property. "When I bought it, the place had been empty for years. The structure was solid, but everything needed rebuilding. I spent months making plans with her. We were going to renovate slowly, together. Picked out every single detail. But before we could really begin, she got sick." His words hung in the air, steady and unembellished. There was no way to soften their weight. The pain wasn't in his voice, but in the way he chose each word so precisely. Eliza sat nearby, leaving space between them. The wind moved through the leaves and carried the faint scent of the cake still cooling inside. She didn't ask questions. She just sat there, leaning slightly toward him, elbows on her knees, eyes lowered to the wooden planks beneath her feet. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "I'm sorry. It's okay. Not many people know. I don't really talk about it. I can imagine." They sat in silence for a while. Then Eliza added, barely louder than a whisper, "My mom passed suddenly too. There were no plans. No time to prepare. One day, I looked up, and everything was mine. To carry. Mia, the bills, the apartment. Flowers were all I knew, so I stayed. Until the shop closed. Until the apartment was gone." Graham listened without a single interruption. His gaze didn't shift, nor did he offer any sympathetic phrases. But there was something in his presence, a quiet understanding, as if he knew what it meant to keep standing when everything else had fallen apart. The conversation didn't last long. After a few minutes, he stood and said he'd make some tea. Eliza remained on the porch, watching the sky turn darker. No confessions, no hidden meanings. But something between them had shifted. For the first time, they'd shared more than routines and roles. And that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. It wasn't the tragedy in Graham's past that struck her. It was the way he carried it. Quiet, steady, familiar. When she came back inside, the kettle was on the stove and 2 mugs sat waiting on the table. Graham was nowhere in sight. But the gesture said enough. She drank in silence and cleaned up after herself. Her body felt lighter, though she didn't know why. That night she went to bed early, not because she was tired, but because her thoughts needed room to settle. Graham's image returned in fragments, his focused gaze, composed posture, restrained grief. She replayed the words he'd used. It was supposed to be hours, and felt something stir in her chest. They were there for different reasons, but something about starting over clung to them both. Eliza still didn't know how much she could trust him or what exactly was taking shape between them. But she no longer saw him as just the man who signed the eviction, or just the man who opened his home. There were more layers now, and she was beginning to see them one by one, even if she wasn't ready to name what that meant. The news arrived on a rainy morning when Eliza had already lost track of how many resumes she'd sent. A local grocery store in Montpelier replied to her email, inviting her for an interview the next day. The job was for a full-time florist assistant with immediate start. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to start again. The distance, however, made things complicated. It would mean relocating, finding a new place to live, enrolling Mia in another school all over again. Eliza printed the message, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her planner. She didn't say anything until later that afternoon. When Mia came home from school, tired and with wet shoes, Eliza knew she couldn't uproot her again so soon. Mia talked about a kind teacher, a classmate who was also new, a book borrowed from the library. She was settling in. And that meant more than any paycheck. Graham passed by them in the hallway, holding a stack of mail. He exchanged a quick comment with Mia about the weather, made a passing remark about the smell of pie in the oven, and headed to his office. Nothing out of the ordinary, but Eliza felt the need to talk. She knocked on his door later that evening, just as the sky began to dim, and asked if he had a moment. They sat on opposite sides of the desk. She explained the offer she'd received, mentioned the town, the job, the logistical hurdles. She never said she was going to accept. Just laid it all out. Graham listened carefully. "It's a start," he said. "It is. I just don't know if it's the right time." He didn't push, just suggested she think it over. Before she left the room, he added, "You're both welcome here. There's no time limit. You don't need to justify every decision." Eliza thanked him and walked out, her heart unexpectedly tight. She understood the freedom he was offering, but also sensed something unfamiliar. This house, despite not being hers, was starting to matter. That night, the tension she'd been holding boiled over in an argument. It started with a comment about the garden. Graham had suggested moving some pots, and Eliza took it as criticism. Her reply was sharp, and he snapped back too quickly. The disagreement escalated fast. Eliza stood up, accusing him of still acting like he controlled everything. He cut her off, saying he never imposed anything, that he'd always made it clear they were there by choice. "Don't pretend it's that simple," she said, her voice shaking. "You pulled us out of one place and put us here. I don't know if it was kindness or just guilt." He stood too, eyes locked on hers, and for the first time they both said what had been building silently. Maybe it was both. "But I'm not the villain in your story, Eliza, and you don't have to fight me every step of the way." The words hung heavy between them. She left the room without another word, headed to her bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to breathe. Mia was already asleep. The fight had been short, but enough to leave her shaken. It wasn't about pots. It was about everything. Trust, acceptance. Staying up the next morning, as she brewed coffee, folded laundry, and watered the greenhouse plants, Eliza knew her answer. She wasn't going to Montpelier. Not yet. Not with Mia finally finding stability. Not with the garden still finding its shape. Not with so many questions still waiting. Later that day, when she saw Graham, she didn't mention the interview. She simply asked if he wanted her to pick up some new seeds at the store. He gave a simple nod. And that was that. Over the weekend, she prepared a meal with fresh ingredients from the garden. Tomatoes, rosemary, mint. She made a salad with goat cheese and served it with slices of warm baguette. Mia helped set the table on the porch, and Graham showed up a few minutes later, dressed in light clothes, his hair tousled from the breeze. The three of them sat down. They talked about ordinary things. The weather, school, the plants, no mention of the fight, or the offer she had turned down. But there was something new in the air, a kind of comfort that came without trying. As Eliza cleared the dishes, she looked around more carefully. The house still wasn't hers. But that Sunday, for the first time, she didn't think about leaving. That night, Mia went to bed early. She was tired from the week and wanted to finish a book before class the next day. Eliza stayed in the kitchen, drying glasses slowly. Graham appeared in the doorway, silent at first. Then he said, "The garden looks good." She thanked him without turning around. "Still needs work, but it's less neglected." He stayed a moment longer, then walked away. Eliza finished tidying up and went to her room. When she turned off the light, she fell asleep faster than usual. There were noises around the house, the wind against the windows, but none of it bothered her. Her body seemed to accept the space, as if it already understood what her mind was still trying to resist. She had decided to stay. And even if she hadn't said it out loud, she knew it wasn't just for Mia. The week started with mild temperatures and clear skies, which motivated Eliza to return to the garden early in the day. With Mia at school and the house quiet, she spent the morning reorganizing the herb beds and preparing the soil for new seeds. She didn't expect company, but Graham showed up beside the greenhouse with a spade in hand, unannounced. He wore canvas trousers and a rolled-up shirt. There was something different in the way he looked at her, more open, more curious. "Can I help? Or am I just going to mess everything up?" Eliza smiled faintly. "You can dig." "Here," she said, pointing to a spot next to the lavender. He got to work carefully, following her instructions between explanations. As the spade turned the earth, his eyes occasionally found hers. When his sleeve slipped, revealing a forearm streaked with soil, she chuckled. "Not sure you were born for this." "Probably not. But I like learning from someone who knows what they're doing." The compliment wasn't rehearsed, and Eliza felt it. They worked together for over an hour in easy silence, interrupted by small comments about the texture of the soil, the strength of the roots, the surprise of seeing a flower return after being forgotten. Graham listened with genuine interest. He didn't pretend to pay attention, he actually did. And that was what slowly unraveled Eliza's defenses. When he reached for the watering can, their fingers touched briefly. It wasn't an accident. It was a pause. His gaze followed, steady. He didn't say anything, nor did he move away. Eliza was the one who pulled the can toward her, firm but not abrupt, like someone trying to catch their breath. Graham smiled, like he was holding on to a small secret, and that moment changed the air between them. Later, still alone, they decided to bake something in the kitchen. There was flour and fruit left, and Eliza suggested a tart. Graham joined in with more enthusiasm than she expected. They picked the apples together, sliced them thin, and measured each ingredient with almost obsessive care. When a puff of flour landed on his shirt, Eliza laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't let out in a while. That definitely wasn't in the plan. "So there's a plan now?" he teased, brushing at his shirt. She looked away, but her smile lingered. The atmosphere had shifted. There was ease, companionship, and a strange sense that the moment held its own weight, needing no explanation. When he moved behind her to reach the oven, his hand brushed her waist ever so lightly, but her skin reacted. Her whole body noticed that Eliza tried to stay focused on the steps, the tasks, the mental list she recited to keep from slipping. But she couldn't ignore how he looked at her. There were no overt gestures, just a fixed, attentive gaze that made her wonder if he saw more than what she let on. After placing the tart in the oven, they leaned side by side against the counter. Neither moved for a moment. He said something about the smell of cinnamon, and she agreed, though her voice was softer than she meant. He was too close. She felt his warmth without contact. She didn't want to read too much into it, but her body already had. When he turned and their eyes met again, her breath hitched. She didn't back away. She didn't lean in either. But the need to understand what was happening lingered between them. The tart finished baking 20 minutes later, but it was no longer the focus. They ate quietly, exchanging glances and small smiles. Then he washed the dishes while she dried them. When a drop of water landed on her arm, he wiped it with a towel quick, but his fingers stayed a moment longer than needed. Eliza didn't pretend not to notice. Upstairs in her room, her heart beat faster, her thoughts tangled. Nothing had been said outright. No confessions, no declarations. But everything had shifted. Life continued. The garden still needed care. Mia would be home soon. But inside her, something was different. She couldn't name it yet. But she knew the difference between a casual touch and one that meant more. And that touch, it had meant something. Eliza began avoiding moments alone with Graham. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because she no longer trusted her own reactions. The way he looked at her, the subtle gestures, the conversations that pushed past the boundaries of a host and guest, none of it fit the neat explanation she used to justify staying in his home. Gratitude no longer covered it, and that scared her. Early in the week, Graham suggested they visit a plant fair together in a nearby town. He needed new seedlings for the garden. She turned him down with a vague excuse. 2 days later, she started, skipping breakfast, baking her own bread in the room. She was pulling away, even if she didn't want to admit it. When Mia noticed the change, she asked what was going on. Eliza offered a strained smile, but the discomfort was growing. She was involved, and the doubt eating at her was crueler than rejection. Was he just trying to help someone he saw as fragile? It all came to a head on a cloudy afternoon. Mia was at school. The house was quiet. Eliza was gathering planters from the garden when Graham appeared on the stone path, carrying 2 boxes of new tools. She only nodded her thanks and kept working, but he didn't leave. "You're different," he said plainly. "Don't bother denying it." Eliza looked up, too tired to keep her guard up. "I'm just trying to stay grounded by pulling away from what's actually working, by not confusing kindness with something else, Graham." Her voice was sharper than intended, but it was out. He stood still, then set the boxes down. "Everything I've said from the beginning has been honest. You can stay here as long as you need. No expectations." "That's exactly what confuses me," she replied. "You act like you're offering me the world, but I don't know why. I don't know if I'm here because you feel guilty or because you actually want me here." His gaze shifted. His body did too. He stepped forward, slower now, and his voice dropped. "You really haven't figured it out, have you?" She didn't move. Figured out what? Graham didn't answer with words. He stepped closer, placed a hand gently on her face, and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It was deep, deliberate, the weight of days of tension. Eliza didn't react at first. Her hands rested on his shirt, unsure, but then she gave in. Her lips opened to his, her breath tangled with his, and the urge to pull away vanished. The kiss lingered, strong and real. When they finally parted, faces close, eyes still locked, Graham whispered, "You're not and never were a charity case." Eliza stood frozen. The kiss, his words, his eyes, none of it felt rational, yet everything made sense. Graham stepped back calmly, lifted the boxes, and returned to the house without another word. It wasn't abrupt. It was intentional. He knew she needed time to process that. She stayed where she was, feet on damp soil, chest unsteady, thoughts in pieces. She didn't want to move. She didn't need to. She raised a hand to her lips, trying to hold on to the memory before it spread. The taste of the kiss was still there. And for that day, nothing else mattered more. Later, when Mia returned from school, Eliza kept up the usual rhythm. Asked about class, served dinner, washed dishes. But her sister watched closely. As they got ready for bed, Mia stood in the doorway. Something happened, didn't it? Eliza hesitated, then nodded. She sat on the bed and told her not everything, but enough. That they argued, that she'd said things she might regret, that he replied with something that unrattled her, and that, in the end, he kissed her. Mia paused, then crossed her arms. "You were the last to know." "What?" "He looks at you like nobody else does, and you pretend not to see it. He's not just kind. He likes you, Eliza, and there's nothing wrong with liking being here." Eliza had no reply. Mia shrugged and walked out like the matter was settled. But for Eliza, it wasn't. She turned off the light and lay in the dark, the taste of the kiss lingering, his words echoing, "You're not a charity case." And whatever came next, she'd have to figure it out on her own. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the house stayed the same, but everything inside it had shifted. Eliza and Graham saw each other often, shared glances that lasted longer than they should, exchanged words that carried meanings beneath the surface. There were no new kisses, no conversations about what had happened, but the closeness grew in subtle ways. He'd place 2 mugs next to the coffee pot in the morning. She'd pause by his office door to mention something small, just to catch his half-smile that now seemed reserved only for her. Mia noticed, and unlike what Eliza feared, she responded with ease. She went to school, told stories about her classmates, curled up on the couch with her books, and laughed in a way that made the house feel fuller. As if she already understood what Eliza took longer to accept, that this house was theirs now, not just in practicality, but in feeling. One Saturday afternoon, while Mia was away at a school activity, Graham walked into the garden with 2 mugs of tea and said simply, "Thought you might not have had anything yet today." Eliza was kneeling near the rosemary bed, hands dirty, hair tied up. When she looked up, he was wearing a light shirt with rolled-up sleeves and a gaze softer than usual. She took the tea with a brief smile and gestured toward the stone bench. Beside her, he sat. For a few quiet minutes, they just looked out at the fields. Only the wind in the leaves and the occasional hum of a bee moved the moment forward. "I was thinking about rearranging the bigger pots," she said, pointing to a group of hydrangeas. "But I'll need help." He set his mug down and stood. "Tell me what to do," she directed. They moved pots with care, measured spacing, tested combinations. Graham handled the heavier ones with confidence, following her guidance. Eliza stepped closer, gesturing, adjusting. At one point, while she guided a rim, her hand slid over his. Neither of them moved. They stayed like that for a few seconds, breathing in close range. When she finally let go, she looked down and said she'd grab more soil. He said he'd wait there. The ordinary scene didn't match what pulsed beneath the surface. Her body already reacted easily to his presence, tight muscles, quick breath, a mind that wandered. It wasn't a surprise anymore. It was recognition. She was falling for him, and that made her want to stay. That evening, they made dinner together. It was simple fresh pasta, cheese, a few herbs from the garden. Graham had gone into town and returned with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses wrapped in paper. They laughed at the improvisation and served themselves right there in the kitchen, standing between dishes. Eliza admitted she didn't drink often, but this evening called for it. He raised his glass to what wasn't in the plans. She clinked his gently, heat rising in her cheeks. The wine was smooth, the atmosphere smoother. When Mia came home, she found them mid-laughter, Graham telling some story from his teenage years. She gave a playful whoa and grabbed a plate. The 3 of them sat at the table. It was easy, familiar, but layered with something none of them said aloud. A feeling of belonging, a presence that didn't need labels. Later, Mia went to bed early. Eliza cleaned up the kitchen. Graham dried dishes beside her. At one point, she turned with a towel in hand and paused. He was watching her, not with raw want, but something deeper, as if admiring someone he'd grown to care for and now couldn't help but desire. Her body reacted. His eyes drifted to her lips, then back. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The air between them held the truth. When he stepped closer to put away a dish and their shoulders nearly touched, Eliza wished she could freeze the moment. Upstairs, with the house quiet, she sat on her bed doing nothing. Mia was already asleep, tucked in with her book beside her. Eliza looked out the window. The garden lights glowed. The pots were lined up just right. The tea mugs still sat on the stone bench. Their hands earlier, the looks, the wine, the laughter, they played in her mind like a sequence she didn't want to lose. For the first time, the sense of belonging was crystal clear. It wasn't about refuge or adapting. It was about choosing. And now, that choice didn't feel like surrender. It felt like want, the want to stay, to continue, to live the very thing she hadn't dared imagine before. The garden had become more than just a beautiful space. It was now the visible reflection of steady care, of a living presence, of a transformation that mirrored what was happening inside the house. The flowers were aligned, the repurposed pots had fresh coats of color. The herbs grew in tidy rows, and even the vines that once sprawled aimlessly now traced the edge of the wall. Neighbors began to take notice. It became common for someone to slow down while walking past, eyes scanning the yard with quiet curiosity. One afternoon, under an open sky, Graham was chatting with a neighbor by the gate when the man gestured toward the garden. The house looks different. Who's taking care of all that? Graham answered without missing a beat. Eliza. She lives here with me. It was the first time he said it like that. Naturally. Without explanation, without apology. And that phrase changed everything. The man asked if Eliza might be interested in helping with his mother-in-law's garden. Someone trustworthy and skilled was needed. That weekend, 2 more requests came in. Within days, Eliza had more work than she ever thought possible. All through word of mouth. She smiled with genuine enthusiasm. For once, her effort was being seen without her needing to prove anything. That same day, Mia came home from school with an extra backpack and announced she'd be sleeping at a friend's house. They had a group project to finish and would stay together overnight. Eliza texted the parents to confirm and helped her sister pack. Once Mia left, the house felt quieter than usual. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged with anticipation. Graham appeared in the kitchen moments later, holding a bottle of wine he'd saved from the last farmer's market. "Feels like tonight calls for it," he said, lifting his eyebrows with a small smile. Eliza was in socks, her hair in a low bun, with traces of soil still under her nails. He opened the bottle while she finished putting away dishes. They sat on the porch like so many times before, but that night, everything felt different. She talked about the new clients, about how satisfying it was to work with something she understood deeply. He listened intently, now and then slipping in a teasing comment or a direct compliment. "You talk about the garden like you're describing a body." She laughed. "Maybe I am. There are parts that need care, others you learn over time." The conversation slowed and deepened. The wine had an effect, but it wasn't responsible for the shift. It was time, connection, the trust that had grown between them. Eliza pulled her knees up onto the bench, tugged at her pants to cover her ankles, and pointed out something about the stars. Graham looked at her with new focus. His gaze lingered on her knees, then traveled to her face. Her body reacted before thought could interfere. When he reached to take her glass, their fingers brushed. It wasn't a coincidence. He held on. "Still afraid to stay here?" She didn't answer. Her eyes already had. He leaned closer. The kiss was slow but heavy. His mouth met hers with certainty. Eliza responded with equal intent. His hand slid too. Her waist, his fingers tracing the outline beneath her shirt. She didn't pull away. They parted just to breathe, and then he took her hand. "Come with me." She went. His bedroom window was open, the curtain moving gently in the breeze. He left. The lights off, turning on only the lamp beside the bed. Eliza kicked off her shoes in the hallway and stepped in barefoot. They didn't speak. Their bodies led the way. Clothes came off gradually, no hurry, just quiet exploration, kisses that deepened, hands moving with new boldness. There was no rush, yet an urgency built from all the tension of the past days. Skin met skin like it had always known how. He touched her with care, but also with hunger. And she gave herself in full, calmly, without holding back. It was the same room she'd entered as a guest, but her body now belonged. They breathed each other in. Their eyes stayed open. It wasn't just desire. It was understanding. In the middle of the night, Eliza stirred under the sheets, his arms still draped over her waist. The feeling was unmistakable. Something had changed. There was no confusion, no fear. Just the awareness that she was exactly where she wanted to be. Her fingers traced his chest as she listened to his steady breathing. She laid her head down again, remembering how she'd once arrived here, unsure of being welcomed. Now, it was the place where she had fallen asleep, after being wanted and after choosing to stay. She closed her eyes again, not worrying about the next day. It would come with clients to meet, stories from Mia's school, and the rhythm of everyday life. But tonight she already knew. There was no more running, no more defense. The storm had passed, and what remained was peace. Months had passed since the night Eliza fell asleep beside Graham, her entire body declaring that this was the right place. The garden continued to bloom stronger with each week, but now it was only a piece of everything that had taken root there. The house had shifted. It was no longer a temporary refuge. It echoed with voices, footsteps, and warmth. Mia left her sneakers by the stairs, scattered books across the table, and laughed loudly as she recounted her school day. Eliza managed her schedule as an independent gardener, rising early, returning home with hands covered in soil and her cheeks kissed by the sun. Graham worked less in the office. He spent more time in the kitchen, brought home flowers from the market, and helped build wooden frames for the larger pots. At night, they cooked together, and they slept together every night. He no longer occupied his room alone. She no longer spent her days wondering when to leave. Neither of them felt the need to explain their presence. They were in love. Graham fit into their rhythm with a quiet ease that gradually became part of what home meant. He was no longer the one offering shelter, nor were they guests occupying borrowed space. They were three people under one roof, each with quirks, routines, and noises, and it all worked. Mia came home full of stories, dropped her things across the living room, and asked for help building school projects on the dining table. Eliza balanced her clients with household tasks, and Graham was always there, unobtrusively, thoughtfully, stocking her favorite fruit, keeping Mia's favorite cheeses in the fridge, bringing flowers on weekends with no occasion. Over time, Eliza began to understand that what she once called protection was, in truth, love. Constant, attentive, calm love. The kind she'd never experienced before and now couldn't imagine being without. One quiet Friday night, with the house already asleep and the bedroom lit by a soft bedside lamp, Eliza appeared in the hallway wearing only his shirt. Her hair was down, her feet bare, her eyes light. Graham sat on the bed reading. He closed the book as soon as he saw her. She leaned against the doorframe and smiled. "Do you really love me, or are you just smitten with the garden?" She teased Dodd. He set the book down, stood, and placed his hands on her waist. "I love you. The garden's just a bonus." She laughed and tugged at his collar. Their kiss was unhurried. Their bodies knew each other, but each touch still brought surprise. That type of desire didn't fade, it matured. They made love slowly, deliberately, exchanging whispers between kisses. Later, tangled in each other, fingers intertwined, he turned to her. "I want to marry you." Eliza turned to face him, hair spread across the pillow, eyes searching his. "Are you asking me now?" "I am. Here, in our bed. No ring, no stage, just you and me." She paused for a moment, then smiled softly, tears welling. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her fingers one by one. Neither of them said anything else. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, legs tangled, hearts settled. There were no more doubts, no more fear. Their beginning hadn't been planned, but their future would be. Together. Sunday morning, they had breakfast on the porch, baguette, butter, apricot jam. Mia appeared with wet hair and asked if they could go pick out new flowers. Eliza said yes, and Graham offered to pack a picnic. It had become their usual kind of outing. They weren't in a rush. They had time. They had routine. They had love. As the house filled with the clink of dishes and the soft glow of a late morning sun, Eliza looked over at Graham arranging the picnic basket on the table and thought with complete certainty, "This is who I want to be with, always." The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.